In exploring the temple of the dollar, or what could also be called the temple of cash or money, it would be helpful to imagine two train tracks. Of course, you can imagine any other things, roads or whatnot, but in this context, I prefer train tracks. And on one of those train tracks, we find one entity, and on the other train track, we find a similar entity. Now, both look similar together, but they're not the same. One of these tracks, or one of these trains, we'll refer to as the constitutional government. And of course, in this sense, we're talking about the U.S. Constitution, but this could be applied to pretty much any entity or place around the world. And on the next track, we have the Constitutional Bank. These two trains seem similar, but they're not. Now, one of those trains becomes derailed, and then its position is taken over by the other train jumping tracks and continues on as if it in the place of the original, as if it was that. And this is what I like to call track jumping, but it could also be found in the rather mundane process, or in the idea of identity theft, which is a word that imparts an emotional charge to what is otherwise the mundane activity of pretending to be someone else. And this can be found with institutions. You can have parallel institutions, you can have parallel people, different people that appear similar and sort of travel along parallel tracks and whatnot. So, and churches. So this concept could be found in many different places. But it is very helpful for putting into context the content of this video, and that is the temple of the dollar. The constitutional bank train, of course, is a representation of the temple itself. Now, the first pattern that becomes apparent is the presence of the temple, and this is alluded to in the Levantine Adventure, Travels and Missions of Chevalier d'Arbus, 1653-1697 by Warren H. Lewis, and this is the first edition. On page 147, it states on page 147 that in September we find him, and of course this is referring to a person called Noatel, half dead with heat and thirst on the banks of the Euphrates, which is hardly on the direct route from Palestine to Constantinople. And when the port next heard of him, he was making a swaggering entry into Athens. Now, for backstory, earlier in the book, it talked about this particular individual, and he was taking a leisurely stroll around the Levant after being recalled from his office as ambassador or something like that, consul. But it states that still at Athens, he did render one valuable service to posterity. He was perhaps the last traveler to see the Parthenon as it left the hands of its builders, for in 1686 a Venetian shell reduced it to ruins, and had it not been for Noatel ordering his traveling artist to sketch the building and its friezes in detail, its restoration would have been impossible. Now, I don't know how true that is, but that does give us an idea about the history of these places. Now, of course, the Parthenon looks a lot similar to its sister, the Acropolis, and other such temples that were built of allegedly Greek or Roman origin, although I find that difficult to believe that they originated with Greece and Rome anyway. But the structures are strikingly similar, and they bear a strong resemblance to the U.S. Supreme Court, of course, as many are aware. But they also resemble another building that less people are aware of, and that is called, or was called, the first U.S. bank, or the first bank of the United States. And of course, there were three, actually, so the first U.S. bank was actually technically the second, and then the second was the third. So if that's not confusing, then it will get a lot more confusing. Of course, one of the least taught subjects, and possibly one of the most important that should be at least included in any sort of curriculum at schools would be the class on banking. And many might consider this the civics class, but the civics classes are actually more of just teaching the derailed train fraud and the identity theft of the U.S. bank pretending to be the U.S. government. Now, when it comes to the context of current world circumstances, there's a few other analogies that can be useful, and one is that of the farmer and his guard dog. In this context, the people take the place of the farmer, while the military takes the place of the guard dog or watchdog. Now, the police occupy the analogy of the fox coming to steal the farmer's chickens and other livestock and whatnot, and to dig holes in the fence and things like that, while the bank forms the position of the wolf, while the police is not as intimidating as the bank, just so the fox is not as intimidating as the wolf. But both are equal problems, and when the military guard dog is not doing its job, they have, of course, free reign over the farmer's livestock and crops and whatnot. Property, basically. With the Bank of North America in the Wikipedia page, it states that, quote, "The Bank of North America was the first chartered bank in the United States and served as the country's first de facto central bank." De facto means of fact. So another way to say that would be practically. It's practically first central bank. Chartered by the Congress of the Confederation on May 26, 1781, and opened in Philadelphia on January 7, 1782, and it was based upon a plan presented by Superintendent of Finance Robert Morris on May 17, 1781, based on recommendations by Revolutionary figure Alexander Hamilton. Although Hamilton later noted its essential contribution to the war effort, the Pennsylvania government objected to its privileges and reincorporated under state law, making it unsuitable as a national bank under the federal constitution. Instead, Congress chartered a new bank, the First Bank of the United States, in 1791, while the Bank of North America continued as a private concern. Now, there's a few things that this teaches us. The first, of course, is the shell game of constantly changing names and reincorporating and moving around different entities, which are basically the same thing. They're just changing them up slightly so it looks like it's something different. And another thing is, a lot of this stuff is happening without the consent of the people, which sort of makes it appear like it's operating under an incorporated entity, which is in itself a bank. And so here we get sort of an eluded context to the idea of the track jumping and the derailed train being taken over by another, which is similar and essentially steals its identity of the first, steals identity first. And the Bank of North America was, of course, public and then went private. No surprise there. Seems like money laundering and stealing funds and all that. And then it was founded in 1781, which is ironic because 1871 is the date that the rather egregious treaty was signed with the United Kingdom, which would have been called something else at the time. And that is a rather important date when U.S. Grant in 1871 basically signed away the United States, but then again, it was already at that point conquered, so to speak. And then it was everything else that was located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, its founders, allegedly, were Robert Morris, Alexander Hamilton, William Bingham, and others. And it was merged, and it later became the Pennsylvania Company for Insurance on Lives and Granting Annuities, or Wells Fargo. And Thomas Willing was the president, and Tench Francis Jr. was the cashier. And then this takes us on to the first Bank of the United States, which is actually technically the second Bank of the United States. And it starts out by saying the president, directors, and company of the Bank of the United States, commonly known as the First Bank of the United States, was a national bank, chartered for a term of 20 years by the United States Congress on February 25th, 1791. Now, I would argue that is not actually commonly known as the First Bank of the United States. This is actually commonly known as the government of the United States, because what we have right now is a bank. And the most logical conclusion is that the original train, the legitimate government, was derailed by the illegitimate government, the bank, which isn't a government. And then that basically took the role and pretended to be the government and has been doing so ever since. And it continues saying, it followed the Bank of North America, the nation's first de facto national bank. However, neither served the functions of a modern central bank. They did not set monetary policy, regulate private banks, hold their excess reserves, or act as a lender of last resort. Yes, that's what our alleged government does right now. And they were national insofar as they were allowed to have branches in multiple states and loan money to the U.S. government. Other banks in the U.S. were each chartered by and only allowed to have branches in a single state. And of course, there is, just like with everything, a bunch of word games going on here and playing with definitions and other things like that. Now, the first Bank of the United States went from public to private, as always, and it was allegedly liquidated when it was bought by somebody named Girard and turned into the Girard Bank. And here again we get the twisting of words, the changing of names, and the general corporate shell game that likes to be played. And the key people were, of course, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Willing, and George Washington. So that's an interesting addition there. And it states that establishment of the Bank of the United States was a part of a three-part expansion of federal fiscal and monetary power, along with a federal mint and excise taxes championed by Alexander Hamilton, first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton believed a national bank was necessary to stabilize and improve the nation's credit and to improve the handling of the financial business of the United States government under the newly enacted Constitution. Now, a lot of that information obviously is suspect. This being written, it's putting intention, writing intention into actions of somebody in the past. So that's obviously a big sign of revisionism when somebody writes the intentions of another without saying it could possibly be his intention. They say it was his intention. Yeah, well, how would they know? But unless, of course, he wasn't himself, he was just a figurehead, or he might be a fake figure, or he could be somebody who carries the name of Alexander Hamilton as a juridic entity, and the other Alexander Hamilton did something completely different and was involved with something else that was completely different, because that's another element to the jumping tracks, is that it could be a person that steals the identity of another person, or it could be a juridic person that steals the identity of a human person. But in continuation, the first bank building, located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, within Independence National Historical Park, was completed in 1797 and is a National Historic Landmark for its historic and architectural significance. Now, when it comes to the purchase by Girard, after the charter for the first Bank of the United States expired in 1811, Stephen Girard purchased most of its stock as well as the building and its furnishings on South 3rd Street in Philadelphia and opened his own bank, later known as Girard Bank. Girard hired George Simpson, the cashier of the first Bank of the United States, as cashier of the new bank, and with 7 other employees, opened for business on May 18, 1812. That's also a rather interesting date, 1812. But he allowed the trustees of the first Bank of the United States to use some offices and space in the vaults to continue the process of winding down the affairs of the closed bank at very nominal rent. Over its early history, the bank was known as Gerard's Bank or as Gerard Bank, or also as Stephen Gerard's Bank or even the Bank of Stephen Gerard. Gerard was the sole proprietor of his bank and thus avoided the Pennsylvania state law which prohibited an unincorporated association of persons from establishing a bank and which required a charter from the legislature for a banking corporation. Now, the interesting part about that is that the different names that it was known as seem more like they were changing the legal entity, because where one gets shut down, it pops up in another place. And that, of course, is an obvious example of the shell game. And you'll find it with most corporations today, where they are incorporated into another entity with a similar name, which is incorporated into another entity with a similar name, and so on and so forth. And they bounce between states, and counties, and countries. So it's sort of like the idea of a VPN, but for companies. And then next, the second Bank of the United States. The second Bank of the United States was the second federally authorized Hamiltonian National Bank in the United States, located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The bank was chartered from February 1816 to January 1836. The bank's formal name, according to Section 9 of its charter, as passed by Congress, now one has to wonder which Congress that was the President, Directors, and Company of the Bank of the United States. And here we're getting the use of the word president. So we have the President of Banks, and that seems a lot closer to the executive officer that we have today, the President of the United States, which would be more accurately described as the President of the United States government, formerly known as the United States Bank. And then, while other banks in the U.S. were chartered by and only allowed to have branches in a single state, it was authorized to have branches in multiple states and loan money to the U.S. government. And this place, or this institution of the Second Bank of the United States, gets a lot more interesting as we read further. It continues that a private corporation with public duties, the bank handled all fiscal transactions for the U.S. government and was accountable to Congress and the U.S. Treasury. %20 of its capital was owned by the federal government, the bank's single largest stakeholder. Now that's another game that they're doing there with perception. But it's more important to look at how 4,000 private investors held 80% of the bank's capital. It doesn't seem like a lot of people, actually, including 3,000 Europeans. Now, I would bet that those Europeans are priests from the Vatican, of course, possibly from other governmental church structures. More than likely, they're royalty and nobles. Those are your 3,000 Europeans. And the bulk of the stocks were held by a few hundred wealthy Americans. In its time, the institution was the largest moneyed corporation in the world. The essential function of the bank was to regulate the public credit issued by private banking institutions. Through fiscal duties it performed for the U.S. Treasury, and to establish a sound and stable national currency with federal deposits, endowed the bank with its regulatory capacity. Modeled on Alexander Hamilton's first Bank of the United States, the second bank was chartered by President James Madison, who in 1791 had attacked the first bank as unconstitutional. In 1816, and began operations at its main branch in Philadelphia in January 7, 1817, managing 25 branch offices nationwide by 1832. The efforts to renew the bank's charter put the institution at the bank general election of 1832, in which the bank's president, again that word president, Nicholas. And then we turn to another article that's similarly interesting called The Bank War. And it states that the bank war was a political struggle that developed over the issue of rechartering the Second Bank of the United States during the presidency of Andrew Jackson. The affair resulted in the shutdown of the bank and its replacement by state banks. Now that's a highly suspect, probably half-truth that is being presented there. And it states that the date of the bank war was 1832 to 1836, but I would state that the bank war is in fact still going on and has been going on even prior to that, because nearly all conflicts have to do with banks, and that's the reason why they just never seem to stop reincorporating and renaming and changing and shifting, but they still always seem to hold power because the individuals seem to not be taken care of that are doing all this stuff. Anyway, it states that the Second Bank of the United States was established as a private organization with a 20-year charter having the exclusive right to conduct banking on a national scale. The goal behind the BUS was to stabilize the American economy by establishing a uniform currency and strengthening the federal government. Again, I like how these writers always seem to impart a certain knowledge about what the goals and what the motives were, as if they would know. Of course, they won't state that they're speculating, even though they obviously are, but that's because these things are written by propagandists. And if you say something confidently enough, it doesn't matter if you're right or not, people will believe it. Anyway, in continuation, supporters of the bank regarded it as a stabilizing force in the economy due to its ability to smooth out variations in prices and trade, extend credit, supply the nation with a sound and uniform currency, provides fiscal services for the Treasury Department, facilitate long-distance trade, and prevent inflation by regulating the lending practices of state banks. Jacksonian Democrats cited the instances of corruption and alleged that the BUS favored merchants and speculators at the expense of the federal government, well, at the expense of farmers and artisans. Yeah, right. Appropriated public money to risky private investments and interference in politics, and conferred economic privileges on a small group of stockholders and financial elites, thereby violating the principle of equal opportunity. Some found the bank's public/private organization to be unconstitutional, argued that the institution's charter violated state sovereignty. To them, the bank symbolized corruption while threatening liberty. In early 1832, the president of BUS, Nicholas Biddle, in alliance with the National Republicans under Senators Henry Clay, Kentucky, and Daniel Webster, Massachusetts, submitted an application for renewal of the bank's 20-year charter 4 years before its charter was set to expire, intending to pressure Jackson into making a decision prior to the 1832 presidential election, in which Jackson would face Clay. When Congress voted to reauthorize the bank, Jackson vetoed the bill. His veto message was a polemic declaration of the social philosophy of the Jacksonian movement that pitted the planters, the farmers, the mechanic, and the laborer against the moneyed interests, benefiting the wealthy at the expense of the common people. The BUS became the central issue that divided the Jacksonians from National Republicans, although the bank provided significant financial interest to Clay and the pro-BUS newspaper editors. Jackson secured an overwhelming election victory. Blah, blah, blah. That is clearly written by some sort of propagandistic airhead professor from some sort of university, alleged university anyway. In continuation, fearing economic reprisals from Biddle, Jackson swiftly removed the bank's federal deposits. In 1833, he arranged to distribute the funds to dozens of state banks. The new Whig Party emerged in opposition to his perceived abuse of executive power. Again, there's that word, executive power. We'll get into that a little bit later. Officially censoring Jackson in the Senate in an effort to promote sympathy for the institution's survival, Biddle retaliated by contracting bank credit, including a mild financial downturn, a reaction set in throughout America's financial and business centers against Biddle's maneuvers, compelling the bank to reverse its tight money policies. But his chances of being rechartered were all but finished. The economy did well during Jackson's time as president, but his economic policies, including his war against the bank, are sometimes blamed for contributing to the Panic of 1837. And then we look at the next article, Resurrection of a National Banking System. First bank in the United States was established at the direction of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton in 1791. Hamilton supported the foundation of a national bank. Oh, here we go again with the implied, stated motive of somebody who obviously couldn't know what the real motive was. But anyway, because he believed that it would increase the authority and influence of the federal government, effectively manage trade and commerce, strengthen the national defense, and pay the debt. It was subject to attacks from agrarians and constructionists. Again, there we go with the labels. Led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And then, of course, naturally, all of these people work together, so they're playing a pretend game of being in opposition. In continuation, they believed that it was unconstitutional because the Constitution did not expressly allow for it, would infringe on the rights of the states, and would benefit a small group while delivering advantage to mainly, especially farmers. Blah, blah, blah. Hamilton's view won out, and the bank was created. More states and localities began to charter their own banks. State banks printed their own notes, which were sometimes used out of state, and this encouraged other states to establish banks in order to compete. The bank, as established, acted as a source of credit for the U.S. government, and as the only chartered interstate bank, but lacked the powers of a modern central bank, it did not set monetary policy, regulate private banks, hold their excess reserves, and whatnot. This was definitely written by propagandists, many elements that show that, so it obviously has to be taken with a grain of salt, because most of the stuff that's written here are half-truths, and most of it's a lie. But it does present some interesting patterns that we can follow. And in continuation, it said, or act as a lender of last resort and could issue only money backed by its capitalization and not fiat money. Of course, that idea of fiat money is another distraction or illusion. President Madison and Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin supported recharter of the first bank in 1811. They cited expediency and necessity, not principle. Opponents of the bank defeated recharter by single vote. Both the House and Senate in 1811, state banks opposed recharter of the national bank because when state bank notes were deposited with the first bank in the United States, the bank would present these notes to state banks and demand gold in exchange, which limited the state bank's ability to issue notes and maintain adequate reserves of specie or hard money. At that time, banknotes could be exchanged for a fixed value of gold or silver. And actually, banknotes can be exchanged for a fixed value of gold or silver, but that's because we don't really know what banknotes are today, because we're taught in the bank-run school systems to keep us as willing property of the bank, essentially. In continuation, the arguments in favor of reviving a national system of finance, as well as internal improvements and protective tariffs, were prompted by national security concerns during the War of 1812. And there we go with another buzzword, national security concerns. I'm sure they used that for then. The chaos of the war had, according to some, demonstrated the absolute necessity of a national banking system. The push for the creation of a new national bank occurred during the post-war period of American history known as the Era of Good Things. Yeah, wonder who knows it as that. There was a strong movement to increase the power of the federal government. Some people blamed a weak central government for America's poor performance during much of the War of 1812. And I would expect that those some people were probably the 80% capital that was put up by those 4,000 or 3,000 from Europe. Those are probably those some people. Anyway, humiliated by its opposition to the war, the Federalist Party, founded by Hamilton, collapsed. Nearly all politicians joined the Republican Party, founded by Jefferson. It was hoped that the disappearance of the Federalist Party would mark the end of party politics. But even in new single-party system, ideological and sectional differences began to flare up once again over several issues, one of them being the campaign to recharter the bank. Yeah, what a surprise there. That's called... That's either called lying or, well, from one perspective or another, it's lying because they're either staging a play of pretend competition or this person is lying flat out. That is writing this article. Anyway, in 1815, Secretary of State James Monroe told President Madison that a national bank would attach the commercial part of the community in a much greater degree to the government and interest them in its operations. This is the great desideratum, essential objective of our system. Support for this national system of money and finance grew with the post-war economy and land boom. There's another buzzword there, post-war. Yeah, that sounds like a professor. Uniting the so-called professor. United the interests of Eastern financiers with Southern and Western Republican nationalists. The roots for the resurrection of the Bank of the United States lay fundamentally in the transformation of America from a simple agrarian economy to one that was becoming independent with finance and industry. Vast western lands were opening for white settlement, accompanied by rapid development enhanced by steam power and financial credit. Economic planning at the federal level was deemed necessary for Republican nationalists to promote expansion and encourage private enterprise. At the same time, they tried to Republicanize Hamiltonian bank policy. John C. L. Calhoun, a representative from South Carolina and strong nationalist, boasted that the nationalists had the support of the yeomanry who would now share in the capital of the bank. Yeah, pretty much all of that is suspect. It's just a bunch of propaganda buzzwords and talking in code, clearly written by some brain-dead idiot from the centers of propaganda that we call universities. Anyway, direct opposition from old Republicans led by John Randolph Roanoke, who saw the revival of national bank as purely Hamiltonian and a threat to state sovereignty. But with strong support from nationalists such as Calhoun and Henry Clay, the recharter bill for the Second Bank of the United States was passed by Congress. The charter was signed into law by Madison on April 10, 1816. That would probably be more accurately described as signed into regulation, because that's not what a law is. Anyway, the Second Bank of the United States was given considerable powers and privileges under its charter. Its headquarters was established in Philadelphia, but it could create branches anywhere. It enjoyed the exclusive right to conduct banking on a national basis. It transferred treasury funds without charge. The federal government purchased a fifth of the bank's stock, appointed a fifth of its directors, and deposited its funds in the bank. BUS notes were receivable for federal bonds. Demise of the Bank of the United States. The economy improved significantly in 1834. Biddle received heavy criticism for his contraction policies, including some of his supporters, and was compelled to relax his curtailments. The bank's board of directors voted unanimously in July to end all curtailments. The Coinage Act of 1834 passed Congress on June 28, 1834. It had considerable bipartisan, there's another buzzword, support, including from Calhoun and Webster. The purpose of the act was to eliminate the devolution of gold in order for gold coins to keep pace with market value and not be driven out of circulation. And here we're getting an explanation for why coinage was removed. An explanation, mind you. It is not the real reason why coinage was removed, because banks don't mint coins, only governments do, and we don't have a government. Anyway, the first Coinage Act was passed in 1792 and established a 15-to-1 ratio for gold to silver coins. Commercial rates tended towards about 15.5 to 1. Consequently, a $10 gold eagle was really worth $10.66 and 2 1/3. It was undervalued and thus rarely circulated. The act raised the ratio to 16 to 1. Jackson felt that with the bank prostrate, he could safely bring gold back. It was not as successful as Jackson hoped. However, it did have a positive effect on the economy, as did good harvests in Europe. And here again we get the European perspective, considering the U.S. bank government is in fact a puppet of Europe in many different ways. The result was that the recession that began with Biddle's contraction was brought to a close. For his part, Jackson expressed his willingness to recharter the bank or establish a new one, but first insisted that his experiment in deposit banking be allowed a fair trial. Censure was the last hurrah of the pro-bank defenders. Last hurrah. Yeah, I don't feel like any American would say that. Well, at least not an intelligent one. Pro-bank defenders and soon a reaction set in. Business leaders in American financial centers became convinced that Biddle's war on Jackson was more destructive than Jackson's war on the bank. All recharter efforts were now abandoned as a lost cause. The national economy, following the withdrawal of the remaining funds from the bank, was booming, and the federal government, through duty revenues and sale of public lands, was able to pay all bills. And there you get the monetary conquest angle being done across the United States via shadowy, well, not really shadowy, but cowards in Europe, basically. On January 1st, 1835, Jackson paid off the entire national debt, the only time in U.S. history that has been accomplished. Yeah, that sentence is full of a bunch of half-truths. It's framing the perspective in a way that we think one thing, but they're actually saying something else, or what is also referred by them as doublespeak, but is basically just lying. Anyway, the objective had been reached in part through Jackson's reforms aimed at eliminating the misuse of funds and through the veto of legislation he deemed extravagant. In December 1835, Polk defeated Bell and was elected Speaker of the House. That's a little bit odd. The last note there, I don't really know what it has to do with the entire context of this. It sort of sticks out. In continuation, on January 30th, 1835, what is believed to be the first attempt to kill a sitting president of the United States occurred just outside the United States Capitol. I wonder which capital that was. When Jackson was leaving through the East Portico after the funeral of South Carolina Representative Warren R. Davis, Richard Lawrence, an unemployed house painter from England, tried to shoot Jackson with 2 pistols, both of which misfired. That seems a little bit out in the open for a real assassination attempt. As we've seen, most assassination attempts are reported as death of natural causes. Or suicides. Haha. Anyway, Jackson attacked Lawrence with his cane, and Lawrence was restrained and disarmed. Lawrence offered a variety of explanations for the shooting. He blamed Jackson for the loss of his job. He claimed that with the president dead, money would be more plenty, a reference to Jackson's struggle with the bank, and that he could not rise until the president fell. Yeah, that seems a little bit theatrical to me, and very unrealistic. Anyway, finally, Lawrence told his interrogators that he was a deposed English king, specifically Richard III, dead since 1485, and that Jackson was his clerk. Well, how would this writer know that for certain, that the person told his interrogators that? Anyway, he was deemed insane and was institutionalized. Jackson initially suspected a number of his political enemies might have orchestrated the attempt on his life. His suspicions were never proven. And there again, we get the writer declaring intent of another person. It's interesting. In January 1837, Benton introduced a resolution to expunge Jackson's censure from the Senate record, and it began nearly 13 consecutive hours of debate. Finally, a vote was taken, and it was decided 25-10 to expunge the censure. Thereafter, the Secretary of the Senate retrieved the original manuscript Journal of the Senate and opened it to March 28, 1834. The day that the censure was applied, he drew black lines through the text, recording the censure, and beside it wrote, "Expunged by order of the Senate this 16th day of January 1837. Jackson proceeded to host a large dinner for the expungers. Jackson left office on March 4th of that year and was replaced by Van Buren. Including when taking into account recession engineered by Biddle, the economy expanded at an unprecedented rate of 6.6% per year from 1830 to 1837. In February 1836, the bank became a private corporation under Pennsylvania Commonwealth law. This took place just weeks before the expiration of the bank's charter. Biddle had orchestrated the maneuver in an effort to preserve the institution rather than allowing it to dissolve, and there we get yet another example of the writer declaring the intent of an individual. This managed to keep the Philadelphia branch operating at a price of nearly $6 million. In trying to keep the bank alive, Biddle borrowed large sums of money from Europe and attempted to make money off the cotton market. Yeah, what a surprise there. Borrowing money from Europe. I don't think that's called borrowing. I think that's called investments or funding. It would probably be more accurately described as funding for a subsidiary. Anyway, cotton prices eventually collapsed because of the Depression, making this business unprofitable. Yeah, that sounds like an explanation to me. To explain away an anomaly. In 1839, Biddle submitted his resignation as director of the BUS. He was subsequently sued for nearly $25 million and acquitted on charges of criminal conspiracy, but remained heavily involved in lawsuits until the end of his life. Well, that's interesting. Who acquitted him? The bank suspended payment in 1839. After an investigation exposed massive fraud in its operations, I feel like that's another buzzword there, massive fraud. It's a little bit odd, the wording. Anyway, the bank officially shut its doors on April 4th, 1841. And next, Jackson's speculative boom in the Panic of 1837. Jackson's destruction of the BOS is believed by some to have set in motion a series of events that would eventually culminate in a major financial crisis known as the Panic of 1834. And this, of course, clearly isn't the same writer because they are still imparting motive or intent, declaring motive or intent, as though they could possibly know that. The origins of this crisis can be traced to the formation of an economic bubble in the mid-1830s that grew out of fiscal and monetary policies passed during Jackson's second term. Yeah, it's just a blah, blah, blah. Let's put words together that don't really mean anything. Combined with developments in international trade that concentrated large quantities of gold and silver in the United States. Among these policies and developments were the passage of the Coin Act of 1834. Now, notice that phrasing, among these policies and developments. See, this writer knows that they are attempting to frame things in a way that it becomes a lie. They know they're attempting to mislead people, and these things come through in very subtle ways. This person knows that the Coinage Act of 1834, for instance, is not a law, but it's a policy. Just like all of the things that they call laws are not laws, they are bank code policies. Because we don't have any laws, because nobody's enforcing the legitimate laws. Well, maybe not no one, but there's at least a few people that are enforcing the legitimate laws right now. Anyway, in continuation, actions pursued by Mexican President Antonio Lopez de Santana and a financial partnership between Biddle and Baring Brothers, a major British merchant banking house. Now, I wouldn't probably call that a partnership. I would probably call that more of the true string pullers presenting themselves. Well, maybe not the true string pullers, but at least another layer. British investments in the stocks and bonds that capitalized American transportation companies, municipal governments, and state governments added to this phenomenon. Woodbury ensured that banks' specie ratios remained consistent with those of the early 1830s. However, since lending was tied directly to the amount of gold and silver that banks stored in their vaults, the influx of precious metals into the United States encouraged American banks to print more paper money. The money supply and number of banknotes in circulation increased significantly in these years. State-chartered financial institutions, unshackled from the regulatory oversight previously provided by the BUS, started engaging in riskier lending practices that fueled a rapid economic expansion in land sales, internal improvement projects, cotton cultivation, and slavery. The federal government earned an average of about $2 million each year from land sales in 1820s. This number increased to about $5 million in 1834, $15 million in 1835, and $25 million in 1836. In 1836, President Jackson signed the Deposit and Distribution Act, which transferred funds from the Treasury Department's budget surplus into various deposit banks located in the interior of the country. The Treasury Secretary could no longer regulate lending requirements in the deposit banks as a result of this legislation. Soon afterward, Jackson signed the Specie Circular, an executive order mandating the sales of public lands in parcels over 320 acres be paid for only in gold and silver coin. Now notice that states a executive order. We'll get into that later. Both of these measures diverted precious metals from the Atlantic coast to western regions, leaving the nation's financial centers vulnerable to external shocks. Another major problem was that the bountiful crop harvests in cotton from the United States, Egypt, and India created a supply glut. The resulting drop in the price of cotton precipitated much of the damage of the financial panic. Now, that's an interesting part to note. This is clearly being written from the perspective of European dominance, and the supply glut provided by the United States, Egypt, and India would directly relate to the British Empire. Anyway, Here we go with the explaining that anomaly way. This is because cotton receipts not only gave value to many American credit instruments, but they were inextricably linked to the bubble then forming in the American Southwest, then centered in Louisiana and Mississippi. Yeah, sure. Southern planters bought large amounts of public land and produced more cotton to pay off their debts. The price of cotton steadily declined during Jackson's second term. In late 1836, the Bank of England began denying credit to American cotton producers. The bank's directors raised interest rates from 3 to 5% and restricted some of the open trade practices that they had previously granted to American import merchants. The directors had grown alarmed that their specie reserves had dwindled to 4 million pounds. And of course, much of this writing is extremely tedious because it is clearly written by a propagandist, and there are few people that are not more tedious. But the more tedious that a topic becomes, the more important it is to understand, because that's one of the ways that they keep people from knowing what they should know, is by making the important stuff boring, or imparting boredom onto subjects that are more important so that they then have less competition in those areas. Anyway, in continuation, directors had grown alarmed that their specie reserve had dwindled to 4 million pounds, which they blamed on the purchase of American securities and poor harvests that forced England to import much of its food. If food imports created trade deficit, this could lead to specie exports. Within months, cotton prices entered a full free fall. And here they go with those ridiculous words. Entered a full free fall. So theatrical. In March 1837, Herman Briggs and Company, a major cotton commission house in New Orleans, declared bankruptcy. A major cotton commission house in New Orleans. Yeah. Declared bankruptcy, prompting the New York Bill Brokerage Company, J.L.S., Joseph and Company, to do the same. In May, New York banks suspended specie payments, meaning that they refused to redeem credit instruments in specie at full face value. Over the next several years, domestic trade slumped, the price of banking, railroad, and insurance company stocks declined, and unemployment rose. 194 of the 729 banks with charters closed their doors. Thousands of people in manufacturing districts lost their jobs. As credit dried up, farmers and planters suffered from price deflation and debt default. Now, of course, all of these look like monetary conquest, which has been going on for a long time, but this period around the Civil War era is very important because this is mainly the period where all legitimacy was lost and how we became fully under the command of a bank pretending to be a government, and we became property of the only legitimate government, the Vatican. In continuation, farmers and planters suffered from price deflation and debt default spiraled. By the summer of 1842, 8 states in the Florida Territory had defaulted on their debts, with outraged international investors. Yeah, outraged international investors. Wonder who they are. Whigs and Democrats blamed each other for the crisis. The Whigs attacked Jackson's specie circular and demanded recharter of the bank. Democrats defended the circular and blamed the panic on greedy speculators. Jackson insisted that the circulation was necessary because allowing land to be purchased for paper would only fuel speculator greed more, thereby worsening the crisis. The circular, he claimed, was necessary to prevent excessive speculation. And here we go with really irritating wording and making this subject incredibly boring and tedious, because this writer doesn't want people looking very closely at this subject. However, let's look closer at the subject in the way that the writer doesn't want us to do, which is by looking at something that's a little bit more entertaining. And this is in the concept of robbing the robbers. This is where you have layers of robbers, where you got one group that robs and then another group comes along. And the easiest example of that would, of course, be the police robbing thieves as the fox, and then that kill that the fox took, the wolf takes. So the fox steals a chicken from the farmer, and then the wolf in turn steals that chicken from the fox, and that is the best example for this type of scenario. But we can look further into this in the Levantine Adventure, which I'll be referencing again in this video. And on page 95, chapter 6, it states that, but what concerns us here is how the Turkish Empire reacted to the news that her territory had been invaded in peacetime, and how the affair of Jigari affected the Eshels, particularly Seed. No Turk was under any illusions as to the consequences of the establishment of a French naval fortress in Algeria. And there was infinite murmuring, which soon swelled into a concerted howl for vengeance, and the death of every Frank on Turkish soil. What made things worse for the French was that they had to face the storm alone, for the other nations hastened to disassociate themselves from all responsibility for the Jigari incident, publishing it abroad that they viewed the French jackboot policy with abhorrence. Nor was there any protection to be anticipated from the Turkish authorities in Seed. For, if the mob sacked the French quarter, these gentlemen were comfortably aware that when the looting was over, all they had to do was to turn out the Janissaries to loot the looters. Friendship would not have won the day against the Turks' ruling passion, avarice, and they would have reported that we were the aggressors, for the dead, like the unfortunate, are always in the wrong. And there we get a comment about the idea of robbers robbing the robbers, and that is mainly how this system is set up. And we also see this similar example with the employees of the government bank that we have, or the bank calling itself government. And what a bank sees as a good employee is something entirely different as what we see is a good representative of the government. And here we get an example of this on page 210. It states, a change of pashas was always a major event in the life of the French community, and there was anxious speculation when on March 30th Kara Mehmet left, unregretted, to take over the Pashalik of Diyarbakir, the capital of Mesopotamia. However, on that same day it was learned that this move was an exchange and that Mahmud Pasha was being transferred from Diyarbakir to Aleppo, a very unexpected posting, for it was a step down for Mahmud, and he was a close relation to the Grand Vizier. Why, asked everyone, was he coming to a governorship where the salary was smaller and the expenses larger? The explanation was characteristically Turkish. Mahmud was a kindly man, and he had not tyrannized over Mesopotamia, but he had let the people fatten at their ease. He was not avaricious, and, says Darvu, was without sufficient invention to find means to rob the folk of Diyarbakir. And precisely this was his crime, for the Porte wished its subjects to be kept poor, believing that the more miserable they were, the easier they were to govern. I feel like those people would have a lot in common with the so-called government representatives today. From the Sultan's point of view, Mesopotamia could not have a better ruler than Kara Mehmet, whose greed was to be long remembered in Aleppo. Yeah, that seems about right. Now, another thing to note here, to allow us to see through all the fog and mystification that goes on and the borification of subjects, is that a legitimate government looks very different from a bank. And the reason why our governments look so similar to banks is because they're not governments. And the distraction of what we call money today is not actually money. But more importantly, that the banks have presidents or executive officers, just like any company. So how did a president become a commander-in-chief who would be a general and not an executive officer of a corporation? Because a military general is very different from a company executive or a bank executive, just like a government is very different from a bank. And one of the things that we find with all of these subjects is that there's a lot of truth mixed in with fiction, because the best way to sell a lie is to make it into a half-truth so that there's some truth to it and people will believe it, that part of the truth, and in that way they'll also believe the lie. And in starting out with our list of presidents, we're of course going to begin with George Washington, who was in fact a general and is possibly a legitimate one. And again, I repeat that, possibly legitimate. But then again, he was listed as president, so who really knows what's true? Because you could have a legitimacy where you have a legitimate general who's then lied about. So there's all kinds of different angles that you can look at this from. And you can't really be certain about anything considering the amount of lying and monetary motive that is behind a lot of these backstories. But when we look at this list of presidents, and for our purposes, I will only be examining up to Lincoln. Well, when we look at this list of presidents, there are certain patterns that unfold, which give us the idea of the fraudulent train jumping tracks and taking the position of the other train, where you have parallel stories, and one of those parallel stories is constructed to mimic or steal the identity of the legitimate one, and we can find that in patterns. First of all, when it comes to George Washington, he was a senior officer of the United States Army before he became president, and of course that is, if he was the true and legitimate commander-in-chief, that would not be a surprise, because the commander-in-chief is supposed to be a general, or the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and naturally the senior officer of the army, that would really not, that would kind of be more like a lateral shift than anything else in a title than anything else. And then he was also commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, so there you get that commander-in-chief. And but the interesting part is he was also Chancellor of the College of William and Mary, and these things could either be lies, or he could be that he just became president of the fraudulent bank government, and he wasn't actually the true commander-in-chief of the legitimate government when that was established. And he was a delegate from Virginia to the Continental Congress, and he was also a member of the House of Burgesses. And of course, as most of us are aware, we are taught about George Washington, although most of the stuff that is taught about him has to be suspect. And it states that in military service, he had allegiance to Great Britain and the United States. Now, Great Britain, as we will note here, is positioned above the United States, and also not referred to as the United Kingdom, which will be an interesting trend that we'll see later on when it comes to these presidents. And of course, one other thing to note is that George Washington was listed as an active duty reserve, or no, not a reserve, but an active duty, what we would call active duty today, which is entirely different from some of the other people on their list, and is a strange anomaly that shouldn't be an anomaly, but it is. And that is the preference of active service over alleged service in the militia, whatever that is. And then the next one is John Adams, who was the second president of the United States. Now again, which United States is that? And then he was the first vice president of the United States. Now, before that, he was Vice President of the United States, and before that, he was United States Minister to Great Britain. What is a Minister to Great Britain? It's an interesting title. And then he was the first United States Minister to the Netherlands, and then he was a United States envoy to France. Now, it's interesting that in this escalation of positions, minister takes a superior role to envoy. That is very interesting, and we're going to look at the distinctions of these titles later using our favorite, or at least my favorite, codex, shall we say, of the Levantine Adventure. Now, he was also chairman of the Marine Committee. One should wonder what that is. And he was also Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Superior Court of Judicature. I don't know what that is, but I feel like that's worth looking into. And then he was a delegate from Massachusetts to the Continental Congress. Now, notice no military service. However, when we look at the Levantine Adventure, it gives us a more accurate concept of what these ambassadorial positions were like for a legitimate government. And it is actually very military. Then we have Thomas Jefferson, who was the third president of the United States. And interestingly, he had a vice president called George Clinton. Huh. Very odd name there, considering certain Clintons or the... and then you've got Clinton body count and all that. And he was the United States Secretary of State. And before that, he was the United States Minister to France. Which is an interesting title, but more interestingly, he was the Minister Plenipotentiary for negotiating treaties of amity and commerce. Doesn't sound like a government title to me. It sounds like a company title. And he was also delegate from Virginia to the Congress of the Confederation. And notice with this word delegate, that sounds a lot like legate, as in the Roman legates. And then he was the second governor of Virginia and delegate from Virginia to the Continental Congress. And these seem like company positions, they don't seem like government positions. Next we have James Madison, and he was the fourth president of the United States. And he was the fifth United States Secretary of State. So here we're starting to see a trend in the positions and elevations of positions and whatnot. They seem more like appointments and less like elections. Now, under his role as Secretary of State, it states that Madison was one of the two major influences in Jefferson's cabinet, the other being Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin. Madison was appointed Secretary of State despite lacking foreign policy experience. That's interesting. An introspective individual, he received assistance from his wife, and here we go with the sanctifying him, like the Vatican likes to do with all of its thousands of saints that it's made. But here starts his backstory of Saint Madison. Anyway, relying deeply on her dealing with the social pressures of being a public figure, both in his own cabinet appointment and as Secretary of State and afterwards. As the ascent of Napoleon in France had dulled Democrat-Republican enthusiasm for the French cause, Madison sought a neutral position in the ongoing coalition wars between France and Britain. Domestically, the Jefferson administration and the Democratic-Republican Congress rolled back many Federalist policies. Congress quickly repealed the Alien and Sedition Act, abolishing internal taxes and reducing the size of the Army and Navy. That's an interesting note there. Abolishing internal taxes. What's an internal tax, I wonder? Gallatin, however, did convince Jefferson to retain the first bank of the United States, though the Federalist political power was rapidly fading away as the national level Chief Justice John Marshall ensured that Federalist ideology retained. Blah, blah, blah. It's an interesting note that it makes there about the First National Bank. And then we have James Monroe. And he was, again, United States Secretary of State, number 7 in that line, and then 5th President of the United States afterwards. And before that, he was the 8th United States Secretary of War, the 12th and 16th Governor of Virginia, and the 4th United States Minister to the United Kingdom. And here we start with this United Kingdom trend. It wasn't called the United Kingdom back then. This is clearly written, but well, obviously it's Wikipedia, so it would be written earlier. But it's definitely written by somebody who doesn't know history, because they would have said referred to, or now referred to as the United Kingdom. And then 5th United States Minister to France. Again, France was not a word that was used to describe that place at that time. And then he was the United States Senator from Virginia, delegate from Virginia to the Congress of the Confederation. And his cause of death was tuberculosis. Now, he's listed as having military service, and that of practical military service in an army, in the Continental Army. But then Virginia militia is listed as military service, which it shouldn't be, considering the militia is everyone. But again, this writer clearly is attempting to obfuscate what the term militia actually represents, listing it as a form of military service. Presence in the militia would not constitute itself military service, but perhaps presence in the militia during time of conflict could represent military service. But being in the militia alone is not military service, because everyone is constantly and always in the militia. Well, maybe not everyone, but at least all fighting capable people. Now, John Quincy Adams is the 6th President of the United States, and that, of course, is after being the 8th United States Secretary of State. What a surprise. And before that, he was the, again, 7th United States Minister to the United Kingdom. Wouldn't have been called the United Kingdom in 1815 to 1817. And, of course, he was the 1st United States Minister to Russia. Equally would not have been referred to as Russia. And he was the 1st United States Minister to Prussia. Also would not have been referred to as Prussia. And then he was the 3rd United States Minister to the Netherlands, which I'm not sure, but I suspect would also not have been called the Netherlands. Next, Andrew Jackson, of which is well known, who could have been a legitimate president, or he could have been a legitimate commander-in-chief, but one must wonder about that, or at least I do. And he was the United States Senator from Tennessee before he became the President of the United States. Of course, if he was a legitimate commander-in-chief, then that would have been from military service and not from being a senator. Anyway, in his biography, of which there is much listed about his military service, and again, a lot of these presidents have very little in their military service portions of the bio, it states that in the War of 1812, Creek War, on June 18th, 1812, the United States declared war on the United Kingdom. That first phrase is so full of propaganda and problems, it is amazing. Because the United States declared war on the United Kingdom. Well, I don't know how they could have possibly have done that in 1812, because neither of those entities actually existed in 1812 in the form of the words being used there. And so that's interesting. At least. Anyway, the causes of the War of 1812 were primarily about maritime issues, imparting motive there, but for the white settlers on the southern frontier. And here we're we're getting the perspective of the writer, of course, whose appearance is very important to this writer, of course. The war provided an opportunity to prevent continued Native American resistance to settlement on their lands, and to undermine British support of Native American tribes, and to pry Florida from the Spanish. Yeah, this person is clearly a brain-dead airhead from the university machine. Jackson immediately offered to raise volunteers for the war, but he was not called to duty until after the United States military was repeatedly defeated in the American Northwest. After these defeats in January 1830, Jackson enlisted over 2,000 volunteers who were ordered to head to New Orleans to defend a British attack. This stuff is definitely so full of lies that it's not really worth continuing on through this quagmire of gobbledygook nonsense. And then we get a list of his military service, stating he was a major general and Tennessee militia, which I don't know how that could be listed as active service. Well, if the Tennessee militia was called to service, then it could be. But the U.S. Volunteers is major general, whatever that is, and then major general in the U.S. Army. Of course, the major general as the U.S. Army would be a lot more important for a legitimate commander-in-chief who would be a general, not the executive officer of a bank or otherwise a corporation. Then we have Martin Van Buren, who is the 8th president of the United States and was the 8th vice president of the United States. So here we get a detraction from either generals or foreign ministers. Again, the foreign minister angle is a little bit odd. Not ambassadors, of course. But this person, of course, naturally, was the 13th United States minister to the United Kingdom. Yeah, I somehow doubt that. But the 10th United States Secretary of State, and here we get the continuation of these trends, and then the 9th Governor of New York, and then the United States Senator from New York. Again, this seems like appointments in a company and a lot less the evidence of a realistic election for a legitimate government. Next, we have William Henry Harrison, who is the 9th President of the United States and the 3rd United States Minister to Gran Colombia. Now, here we get a minister who is sent to a place that would logically have existed at the time. Now, on the other hand, the history of Gran Colombia is very suspicious, especially considering Simon Bolivar was multiple times kicked out of South America. So one has to wonder about that, but that would take a lot more research into the validity of Gran Colombia, and then there's so much line written into our history textbooks, which these Wikipedia profiles are certainly based off of textbooks from the University Machine. Now, he's listed as having military service in the Legion of the United States with the rank of Major General in the Army of the Northwest and in the United States Army with subset of Indiana Territory Militia. So here we get, again, the writer who doesn't know what the distinction between being in the militia, meaning the general populace of all able-bodied fighting people, versus being in the active component of the military, the armed forces. Which, of course, naturally a civilian wouldn't know the distinction, but anybody who's ever served would know very well and very clearly what the distinction between those two spheres is. But it states that he was born into the Harrison family of Virginia at the Homestead Berkeley Plantation in Charles City County, Virginia. He was the son of Benjamin Harrison B., a founding father of the United States. That sounds like the founder of a company, and not so much a legitimate government representative for the people. During his early military career, Harrison participated in the 1794 Battle of Fallen Timbers. I somehow doubt that was a legitimate battle, though. An American military victory that ended the Northwest Indian War. Later, he led a military force against Tecumseh's Confederacy at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. Now, of course, the history of Tecumseh is incredibly suspect as well, which if one looked into, they'd find certain things that can't be confirmed. Wearing the nickname Old Tippecanoe. Now, that nickname that he earned is likely imparted by modern historians and is similar to the nickname of Mad Dog that was imparted to Mattis, who was not a mad dog and was, in fact, not very impressive. Anyway, he was promoted, as far as this is concerned, he was promoted to Major General in the Army during the War of 1812 and led American infantry and cavalry to victory at the Battle of Thames in Upper Canada. Now that's just a bunch of nonsense, and of course naturally the rest of this writing is nonsense and written by somebody who has no practical knowledge of, well, anything other than regurgitating propaganda from textbooks. Next, John Tyler is listed as the 10th President of the United States and the 10th Vice President of the United States. Again, the question is, which United States is that? And then here we get the beginning of the trend of listing presence in the militia as military service, warranting a person to become a commander-in-chief. Naturally, service in the militia would not be preferential to a general who has engaged in actual service, active service in the principal military, because the militia is everyone, and he achieved the rank of captain in the militia, which it would be far more impressive for somebody to achieve the rank of captain in the practical military, and that's definitely something you would want out of a general or otherwise commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Hence, we get this distinction between a president and a commander-in-chief, and how did the president become synonymous with commander-in-chief? The president is not a general, and a general is not a president. But a commander-in-chief is a general, so that's a really odd thing. Now, we also get another anomaly, and that's in James K. Polk, who doesn't have any listed military service whatsoever. And that is a person that's expected to be a capable commander-in-chief? I don't think so. Most of his career allegedly was moving from one political office to the next, which I would refer to political office as a policy office in a corporation. Next, we have Zachary Taylor as the 12th President of the United States. His profile is full of oddities and also stands out as an anomaly from all of the other presidents. And he allegedly served 39 years in the United States Army with allegiance to the United States. Of course, one should ask what United States is that, and he achieved the rank of Major General. Now, the flag put next to United States would not have been the flag used at the time, and likely the 2-star rank that's put next to Major General as a picture to add the image of authority would also not have been used at the time. And then he was apparently in the command of the Army of Occupation and engaged in 4 different wars. Logically speaking, this is a person that you would probably, if this is legitimate, this person you probably would want as a commander-in-chief, but that would have to be thought of in the context of the time, and how there would be many others that would likely have been a superior choice. But who really knows, considering all of the fraudulent history and rewriting of things and revisionism that's been going on. Next, we have Millard Fillmore, who was the 13th President of the United States and 12th Vice President of the United States. And here we have another trend of vice presidents becoming presidents, but then again, we're all pretty aware of that trend today. But the ministers and secretary of states is an interesting trend. However, his military service is listed as New York Guard and New York Militia, as in a commander-in-chief of, or somebody with the rank of major in militia, whatever that is, and captain in a guard, as that would be superior to anyone in the actual active military as commander-in-chief. Yeah, that's doubtful. And then Franklin Pierce is the 14th President of the United States, and before that, United States Senator from New Hampshire. Of course, he also has military service listed, at least, but his military service, again, is relegated to the militia. No, he did serve a time in the United States Army, so there we do have a presence and an active component as a brigadier general. So he is a possible, logically speaking, legitimate commander-in-chief. But again, these are considered the presidents. And next we have James Buchanan, who was the 15th president. And that was from 1845 to 1849. And he, continuing the trend here, was a Secretary of State. That's not much of a surprise there. But he also served in the Supreme Court. That interesting and likely fraudulent entity. And then there's a section where it lists him as ambassador to the United Kingdom. Yeah, like they would have used that word at the time, United Kingdom. I'm sure that the original title at the time would, well, I know the original title at the time would be far longer. It would be like the Great British Isles or illustrious something or other. And then it talks about his service abroad as ambassador to the United Kingdom, which of course is an impossibility, because that was not a position that would have existed at the time. And then of course naturally you have a fraudulent election map that wouldn't have made any sense at the time, and then you also have a lot of sanctifying of this person, as we'll find a lot of that, and a bunch of blah blah blah. But there's an interesting note about this particular president, and that is where it states that he echoed Henry Clay's support for the American Colonization Society. It's an interesting name, which advocated a program of abolition in conjunction with settling freed slaves in Liberia. It's a rather interesting note there, sort of the doublespeak of how we don't believe in slavery, so we're going to make the 13th Amendment that provides an exception for slavery. Yeah, that's called lying. And so this person, as we see, is a proponent of resettlement, and he is a proponent of colonization. Very interesting. Meaning he's for colonization and he's for resettlement of, quote, freed slaves. Yeah, that's a perfect example of doublespeak, or otherwise known as lying. Anyway, the military service is listed as the Illinois Militia in 1832 as captain and private. Again, that's very odd that you have a militia commander alleged as being preferential to an active commander, and then again as militia as being listed as military service. That's all part of the plan to make the militia into a military component that can then be, quote, subordinate to the civil authorities. And we get more backstory and clear line and tedious articles, which I won't read through because it's so irritating. And then when we move on to Lincoln, Lincoln is one of the best examples of sanctifying a position and making an individual into Saint Lincoln, where you cannot question any of his obviously fictional backstory, because if you do, then you're a proponent of slavery, despite the fact that the 13th Amendment provides the exception and legal nature to slavery, and is clearly not a legitimate act in the Constitution, considering previous acts actually prohibit slavery. But don't think too much on that, because otherwise you might become a problem for them. And in putting this into context, at least as far as these positions go, we'll look at the Levantine Adventure, the Travels and Missions of Chevalier d'Arveux. And on page 187, it gives us an idea of what it looked like to be a consul at the time. Well, at least 2 centuries earlier. It states that a short way outside Aleppo, his procession met that of the outgoing consul Dupont. The two men dismounted, advanced, and embraced, and made each other our compliments in a few words so as to avoid as many lies as possible. Yeah. But it is characteristic of Darvou's fair-mindedness that his dislike for Dupont did not prevent him from giving the same meticulous praise to the man's turnout which he had accorded to his own. After greetings had been exchanged, the two processions coalesced to form the Grande Entry, which was drawn up as follows: the merchant's caravan, Darvou's baggage mules with military escort, baggage mules, 12 mounted grooms leading saddled horses sent to honor my entry, 6 cavalry soldiers in bonnet de cérémonie riding 2 abreast, the consular usher, clad in red and well-mounted, 2 interpreters, followed by 4 footmen clothed in red cloth with Polish bonnets of marten fur, with the corners of their vests turned back to show their blue drawers and their half boots of red Morocco leather, each with a long cane which he held up in the air. I believe MM is Monseigneur. Darvou and Dupont, riding exactly level with each other, with on each side of them 4 grooms dressed in red and carrying horse cloths, halters, and shackles to indicate their profession. The 2 leading Dutch merchants, followed by the 2 deputies of their nation. The other merchants, French and Dutch, riding 2 by 2 on beautiful horses magnificently dressed. The servants of all taking part in the procession, and those of distinguished Turks sent to honor the new consul. And of course, that is on page 188. That procession of consul would look very different to the bank-employed consuls of today, which aren't really consuls, but they're more like representatives of a bank, not of a government. And then in 155, on page 155, we get an interesting distinction when it comes to these titles, and a way that we can better understand the titles rather than them just being willy-nilly applied to different people that are clearly not actually embodying that title. Then a fresh complication arose. The Dey of Algiers accused Bordeaux, the French consul there, of being privy to the escape of French slaves and their concealment on board Louis's warships, and declared him persona non grata. On hearing the news, Colbert wrote to Darvou saying that in the circumstances his title had been altered from that of envoy to consul, and in his new capacity he was to undertake a double mission. Firstly, the conclusion of the treaty with the Dey on Louis's behalf, and secondly, the resolution of the Bastion quarrel, or as we would say, bastion. Darvou was horrified and protested to Colbert with his usual eloquence. The dignity of consul was, he complained, inferior to that of envoy, and that it had not been the habit of His Majesty to abase those whom he had once elevated. Furthermore, the Algerian consulate was unpaid and yet involved the consul in considerable expenses, both for presents to the local notabilities and for alms, which had to be given to the French slaves whose patrons did not feed them. Then followed a brisk interchange of letters, which ended in one from Colbert, in which he quoted the proverb, "Either as bishop, either as miller, the king must be served." That the Algerians had never met a Frank of higher rank than a consul, and that so far as the money went, he, Colbert, would not only see that the Bastion company defrayed all expenses, but also that the king should make a fitting acknowledgement of Darvou's services on his return from the mission entrusted to him. There was no more to be said, and with this Darvou had to be content, a little, but only a very little, mollified by permission to add to his title of consul that of agent for His Majesty in Africa. And that is on page 155, but it does give us a good distinction of what these titles might have meant and how an envoy is superior to a consul, interestingly. And then we get further interesting notes about the consulate and what a consul is. On page 172, it says the consolation, or rather the offer it, was not long delayed. On November 4th, Colbert's chief clerk told him that his master was prepared to offer him the Aleppo consulate. And how would the Chevalier receive such a proposal? Probably this came as no surprise to Darvaux, for the Marseille community had already sounded him on the same subject, being discontented at the bad relations between Dupont, who exercised the office, and the merchants. At any rate, he told the clerk at once that he begged to be excused. Trade there, he said, was in a miserable state, expenses were high, and he could not undertake the burden unless he had the wherewithal to support the dignity of such an office. But so far was Colbert from resenting Darvaux's rather brusque refusal that he had once set him to work on criticizing and correcting a memorandum which he himself had just written on the duties and responsibilities of consuls. Now, mind you, these are legitimate consuls of a legitimate government, not banking representatives of a bank pretending to be a government. Hence, the difference between what we have as alleged consuls today and the example of what a real consul is at the time. And in chapter 9, on page 149, we get a better look at this. It states that leaving Toulon on September 3rd, Darvaux arrived at Saint-Germain on the 9th to resume his duties as equerry to his patroness, the Maréchal de la Motte, who, with Louis XIV's children, was still living in the old chateau, and on the 10th he presented himself to the ministers at Versailles. This was a red letter for Darvaux. Now it's interesting that he presented himself to the ministers at Versailles. There we get that word, minister. If I had been well contented with the reception given me by M.M. Colbert and Pompon, I was infinitely more so with that of the king. As soon as he saw me in the door of his room, he took a few steps toward me and did me the honor of saying in his usual gentle and gracious way that he was delighted to welcome me home again, and he proceeded to ask for news of my mission, of which I gave him the essential facts. After this, Darvaux returned to Saint-Germain, there to carry out his old duty of bringing the king and queen a daily report on their children, and to busy himself in preparing a memorandum on the Turkish situation. This document, which he presented to Louis on September 24th, was an able one whose bellicose tone was unlikely to injure the writer with the king. It opened with the statement, after Louis's own heart, all the questions at issue between France and Turkey, said Darvaux, reduced themselves to three fundamental points: the maintenance of God's interests, the honor and glory of the king, and the safety and well-being of his subjects. The first point imposed upon the king the duty of taking a firm line over the activities of Paniotis, the Sultan's chief dragoman, who was using all his influence to replace the Roman Catholics by the Greeks in the guardianship of the holy places. The second centered around the always thorny question of the flag. Since the days of the first capitulation, vessels of all countries which were not represented diplomatically at the port had been compelled to trade under the French flag when in Turkish waters, and the Sultan was trying to reward the appropriate clause in the new capitulation, so that what had been an obligation to fly the flag should become a simple permission to do so. This, according to our Darvaux, would be a slight on the king's dignity, which he ought not to tolerate. The third point mainly concerned the unsatisfactory nature of the Sultan's proposals regarding commercial litigation between Franks and his own subjects. Under the old capitulation, the rules that, in a civil action, the unsupported evidence of a Turk against a Frank was inadmissible, and that a Frank could not be condemned to pay an alleged debt unless the plaintiff put in as evidence a written admission of the existence of the debt signed by the defendant. Safeguards which were of the utmost importance, seeing that under Turkish law an infidel was not allowed to bear witness against a Muslim. The Sultan's impudent proposal was that these safeguards should be abolished in the new capitulation and replaced by an article guaranteeing that the evidence of a false witness against a Frank be not admitted in civil actions, which, as Darvaux pointed out, simply meant that the Frank would be overwhelmed by a cloud of Turkish witnesses and condemned in advance. Darvaux's indignation evidently mounted as he wrote, for at this point he interrupted himself to indulge in a digression on the Turkish character. Here he states, quote, "They are the proudest and most arrogant of men. They think that our honest manners are much less due to natural politeness than to feebleness. Long acquaintance with them has convinced me that they never accord anything but to force. They are incapable of following any argument but one which proceeds from the mouth of a cannon." And that sounds like our alleged representatives of government today who threaten missiles against the people. And in continuation, and having invited Louis to share his indignation, Darvoux proceeded to unfold his plan for bringing the Turk to reason, and incidentally for providing further employment for the Chevalier Darvoux. It is suggested that a fleet of, say, 20 vessels be sent secretly to the Dardanelles, there to embark the French ambassador and at the same time land your Majesty's envoy. My humble self, perhaps, is put in parentheses. Who would proceed to the port and inform the Grand Vizier that the fleet had orders to embark all French subjects, both those in Constantinople and in the Seychelles, and convey them to France. And there we get an example and a definition in practice of what envoys and consuls and ambassadors were, and how so much different the legitimate title and position is presented in comparison to the fraudulent title and position that we have today. And of course, these consuls seem a lot more similar to the consuls of the Roman Empire, at least as they were reported to have been leading troops of men, just like a general might, and there it wouldn't be too far of a step for a consul to become a commander-chief. Now this takes us to an interesting individual of today, and that is a Nebraska politician by the name of Matt Williams. And it states in his Wikipedia bio that Matthew H. Matt Williams, born February 5th, 1949, is a politician from the state of Nebraska in the Midwestern United States. In 2014, he was elected to the Nebraska legislature, representing a district in the south central part of the state. Williams is a member of the Republican Party. And interesting note, he is residing, or listed as residing, in Gothenburg, Nebraska. That's an interesting name, Gothenburg. And later, we'll see why. And his occupation is listed as banker. Now let's see what that means when as an occupation as banker. It states Williams was born on February 5th, 1949 in Gothenburg, Nebraska. His great-grandfather, Henry L. Williams, had settled in the Gothenburg area in the early 1890s, where he farmed and ranched before founding the Gothenburg State Bank in 1902. Williams' grandfather and then his father served as the bank's presidents. Williams worked on the family farm in his youth. He graduated from Gothenburg High School in 1967, then attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, receiving a degree in business administration in 1971. In 1969, he married nursing student Susan K. Wright. The couple eventually produced 2 children. It's a really weird way to say that. Produced 2 children. Like they were, producing livestock or fruit. Intending to become a lawyer rather than to carry on the family's farming or banking operations, he attended the University of Nebraska College of Law. In 1973, however, his father unexpectedly died, and responsibility for the family bank devolved upon Williams. He joined the bank as vice president, commuted between Gothenburg and Lincoln until he completed his Juris Doctor degree in 1974, then moved to Gothenburg in 1979. He assumed the presidency of the bank. During the 1980s U.S. farm crisis, Williams was forced to sell part of his family farm in an effort to keep the Gothenburg Bank alive. The bank attempted to give farmers as much flexibility as possible in managing their loans, and over the course of the farm crisis, only 2 of their farm customers declared bankruptcy. Yeah, that sounds like an attempt to sanctify clearly a corrupt entity. And also, it states that Williams served as chair of the Nebraska Bankers Association in 2003 to 2004. In 2008, he joined the board of American Bankers Association. In 2012 to 2013, he chaired the organization. In September 2013, Williams stated that he was considering running for either the Nebraska governorship or for an open seat in the Nebraska legislature. In late October, he announced that he would seek the legislative seat representing District 36, consisting of Dawson, Custer, and the Northern Third. Buffalo counties included the cities of Gothenburg, Lexington, Cozad, and Broken Bow. Under Nebraska's term limits law, the incumbent John Whiteman, a Republican from Lexington, was ineligible to run for a 3rd consecutive term. Williams, a Republican, faced a single opponent in the contest. Louis Sotelo, a Lexington Democrat, was a college planning specialist working for Education Quest, a Lincoln-based nonprofit established to improve access to post-secondary education in Nebraska. Native of Chihuahua in northern Mexico, Sotelo had been brought to the United States by his parents at the age of 5. He had graduated from Lexington High School in 2007 and from Northwestern University in 2011. Then taught school in Kansas City with Teach for America organization. Of course, these elections are not elections in a legitimate government. They're more like elections within a corporation. It's sort of an internal movement, or it's like seeking promotion, basically, in a corporation. In the course of the campaign, Williams declared that the 2 most critical current issues in Nebraska were water policy, which he described as unsustainable, and the state's tax structure, which he said handicapped attempts to recruit businesses. I think acquire would probably be a better word, or steal. He stated that his background in business and in agriculture and his proven leadership skills were what the voters wanted and needed. Sotelo asserted that education, particularly in early childhood, was a critical issue, and said that the legislature needed members who would represent Latinos, Africans, and the middle class, not just upper class whites. When the nonpartisan primary election was held in May 2014, Williams received blah blah blah, and those votes really mean nothing except as far as the investors in the U.S. bank, or at least in this case the Nebraska Bank Corporation pretending to be the state of Nebraska go. Those investor votes are really what count, and not the state property, meaning citizens, as far as they see it. And here we get different elements of money changing hands and interesting money laundering practices going on here. But it's interesting because there's an interesting section that states legislative tenure. Wonder what that is. In the 2015 legislative session, Williams was named Vice Chair of Banking, Commerce, and Insurance Committee. He was also appointed to the Judiciary Committee. Now, in a government, that would, of course, be considered conflict of interest. But considering he's moving up from a subsidiary position, it's not, because it's simply just a promotion. And the reason why this Gothenburg place is so interesting because it relates directly, at least in name, to the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, otherwise known as the House of Windsor. And in the Wikipedia article, it states the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, German Haus Sachsen-Coburg und Gotha, or Gotha, is a European royal house. It takes its name from the oldest domain, the Ernestine Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Its members later sat on the thrones of Belgium, Bulgaria, Portugal, India, and the United Kingdom and its dominions. It's interesting that it says its members later sat in past tense, and they don't currently sit. And it states that the parent house is the House of Vetten, and it lists under the countries the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Kingdom of Belgium, Kingdom of Portugal, Kingdom of Bulgaria, Principality of Bulgaria, United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and its dominions, and the British Raj. It was founded in 1826, allegedly, 197 years ago, and allegedly the first founder was Ernest I, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and allegedly the current head is Andreas, Prince of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. And naturally, the House of Windsor changed its name, is legitimately, or at least sort of illegitimately, called this house. And the House of Windsor never existed before the name was changed, allegedly. Anyway, in total, it says the list of titles are Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, 1826 to 1918, King of the Belgians, 1831 to 1920, King of Portugal and the Algarves, 1837 to 1910, Consort of the British monarch, 1840 to 1861, Prince of Bulgaria, 1887 to 1908, King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, 1901 to 1917, King of Australia, 1901 to 1917, King of Canada, 1901 to 1917, Emperor of India, 1901 to 1917, King of Newfoundland, 1907 to 1917, King of New Zealand, 1907 to 1917, Tsar of Bulgaria, 1908 to 1946, and then King of South Africa, 1910 to 1917. And it states that the estates of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Belgium, Portugal, and Bulgaria. That's interesting that it states Belgium and Portugal as estates. And it states that it was deposed in 1918 in Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. And the cadet branches are Windsor, United Kingdom, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Coire, Braganza, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Portugal, extinct in 1932. The Bulgarian royal family, the Belgian royal family, Eppinghoven, illegitimate, agnatic. I don't actually know what agnatic means myself, but continuation, it states that founded in 1826 by Ernest Anton, 6th Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, is a cadet branch of the Saxon House of Vetten. One agnatic branch currently reigns in Belgium. The descendants of Leopold I and another reigned until the death of Elizabeth II in the United Kingdom, the descendants of Albert, Prince Consort. And that's, of course, current time, or the so-called modern age. Actually, I guess they call it postmodern in the centers of lunacy that we call universities. In continuation, states in 1917, the First World War caused the British King George V to officially change the name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor in the United Kingdom. And that's, of course, an explanation for what is obviously the same shell game that the corrupt people have been doing for centuries. In Belgium, due to similar resentment against Germany after the Great War, the use of the name was changed in 1920 by King Albert I to de Belgique, French, or Van Belgique, Dutch, or Van Belgien, Belgian, German, meaning of Belgium. However, the Saxe-Coburg house name of the Belgian royal family was never officially abolished, and since relations between Belgium and Germany have been normalized for a long time, the use of this family name has been slowly introduced since the 2010s. Yeah, that's not a surprise, and that's because the so-called normalization is because there is no government of Belgium nor Germany. Those are simply subsidiary organizations of the United Nations, which is, of course, a corporation and a bank, just like the subsidiaries are. And naturally, they would slowly introduce it in the 2010s because it's all about controlling perception. And then, in continuation states, especially since King Philip of Belgium wants to limit the number of princes and princesses of Belgium, and thus the use of the designation of Belgium to only a select group of his family. Wonder how King Philip of Belgium fares today. Anyway, if you have enjoyed this video, please like it, share it, subscribe to my channel, check out my other content, and as always, stay tuned, there will be more.